Hello everyone, it's Lisa here. It's been a long time since I've recorded a video for my channel, but I have something different to share with you today. I'm going to be doing some stitching and I'm using the Spellbinders Advent Calendar. I'm specifically going to be using the dies from day 5 of the Advent Calendar. Each of these windows has a perforated edge, so I'm just taking my tool and running that along the perforations to open that up more easily. You can see there the die that I'm going to be using. This is the gorgeous 5-point star. So I'm just going to fully reveal that for you now, using the tool again to cut that white paper, peel that back, and then I can remove the dies from behind the window. So let's take a closer look at the dies themselves. You get a star outline die which has some dotted detail around the edge, and you get 5 small dies that you use for the stitching element. And I've gone ahead and die cut all of the dies from some white card. I'm using the card that's included in the stitch along kit, and I've die cut the star twice, and I've also cut 10 of the smaller die for my stitching. And often when I do stitching, I like to use 2 layers of cardstock just to provide more stability. So just popping out those little pieces, and then I'm going to adhere 2 of the die cuts together. And I continue to work my way through them so that I'm left with 5 pieces at the end. This really isn't a necessary step, it's just something that I personally prefer to do. It just makes it a little bit easier for me to handle them. I also cut 2 of the star, again not essential as the cardstock is pretty thick. It's just something that I prefer to do just to give a little bit more weight to those elements on the card. So for my first card today, I'm only going to be using items from the Stitch Along kit. So I'm just pulling out the gold diamond thread from the bag of threads that you get with that kit, and I'm going to pull out a really long piece of thread off that reel. I'm actually going to double this up so that I'm working with 2 strands. And now I'm going to go ahead and thread my needle, and you'll see here how long the piece of thread actually is that I'm going to be working with. And because this is a metallic thread, it is a little bit different to the normal DMC threads. It is a bit more tricky to work with as it has a different consistency. So just going to tie a knot at the end just to hold all that together and trim off the excess. And I'm only going to show the stitching for one of these pieces, as it's the same for every section that I do. So just pulling that thread through, and I'm just going to use a tiny little bit of Best Ever craft tape to secure that onto the back. In fact, I actually put 2 down just to make sure that that is really held tightly behind. I started off by bringing my stitching from that little hole at the centre at the bottom through to the first hole on the right hand side of the die cut. I then come back through from the holes on the outer edge of the die back through the central hole at the bottom. I just find it easier to work that way rather than coming up each time from that centre hole at the bottom. That's just the way I prefer to work. You really can do it either way. And I'm only going to show the stitching for one of the pieces, as the stitching is the same on all of them. And I'm just going to flip that round and then work my way down through that other edge. You could use tweezers here if you wanted to. This is quite a small die cut, but I found it manageable if I just turned it round as I stitched. And now that I've finished the stitching on that die cut, I'm going to add a couple of small pieces of yellow tape just to hold that thread in place, and then cut off the rest of the thread and work my way through all of the other die cuts. So I'm now at the point where I can add these onto my star. And I'm just using some wet adhesive for this bit. I did consider using foam squares just to give a bit of extra dimension, but because I already have some bulk at the back of each of those die cuts with the tape, the thread, and the fact that I had knotted my thread, they do actually sit up a little bit from that base anyway. And I'm making sure that I try and space them as evenly as possible. You do get a little bit of time to maneuver them around as I'm using wet adhesive. And you can see now how pretty that star looks with just the simple gold thread against the white. So I've set that to one side whilst I work on the other elements of my card, and I want to add some stripes to my background. So I've taken a piece of print paper. This is about 5.5 inches wide by 2 inches, and I've added some double-sided tape onto the back of that. And I've cut 4 A2 panels out of the cardstock included in the kit. I've got a red, a white, a gold and a teal. And using the paper trimmer with the measurements at the top, I'm going to cut 2 strips from each panel of card, and they're going to be 1/8 of an inch each. Now, this is a colour combination that I really love to use at Christmas. I think that the red and the aqua look so pretty together, and it's a combination I go to often, and I particularly like it if I add in the gold and the white as well. So just working through all of those panels now, making sure that I'm as accurate as I can be with cutting those strips. And I'm going to remove the backing tape off that top piece of double-sided tape and start adhering these strips down. I'm starting off with the gold. And one of the reasons that I've got a larger piece of paper than I actually need is so that I can rest my hand down on that lower section of the printer paper and it doesn't get stuck to the double-sided tape. So I've done the white and I've now done the teal. Just going to peel off the backing tape again from that second piece of double-sided tape, and I'm going to go ahead and add the red, white and the second piece of gold. So the strip actually starts and ends with gold. And now I'm going to trim off the excess and then pop it into my paper trimmer and neaten up those edges, and I'm now going to cut it down to 4 1/4 inches wide. And now I'm going to add some glue onto the back of that strip, and I'm going to place that down onto a white card panel. Now this panel has been cut just slightly smaller than a standard A2 size panel, so a tiny bit smaller than 4 1/4 by 5.5, which means I have a little bit of excess that I need to trim off from the sides. We can now go ahead and position our star over those stripes. So just adding a little bit of wet adhesive onto the back and positioning that over the stripes. And as I've got wet adhesive, it makes it easier just to make sure I've got that positioned exactly right. For my sentiment, I'm going to be using the clear stamp set which is included in the Stitch Along kit. So I've taken the Shine Bright sentiment and I'm going to stamp that down onto some red cardstock. So I've just lined it up in my MISTI. I'm going to add some sticky ink onto the stamp, prep the cardstock with an anti-static powder bag and then press that sentiment down. I'm adding some white detail embossing powder and I do it a couple of times just to make sure I've got good coverage, and I heat set that off screen. And now I'm just going to pop it into my paper trimmer and cut off the excess from the sides and also from the top and the bottom. I've popped a little bit of thin foam tape onto the back of the sentiment, and I'm going to use my tweezers just to position that down across the centre of the star. And the reason that I had my red stripe in the centre of that striped panel was so that when I added the sentiment, it would line up with the red either side. So I'm just adding some foam tape onto the back of my panel. And I'm also going to go over that with some wet adhesive. This is something that I do often with a sentiment or with a larger panel. Adding that wet adhesive onto the foam tape means that you get an opportunity just to shift that around a little bit if it doesn't go on quite straight. So it does give you some wiggle room. So just making sure I've got that lined up properly. And I'm going to finish off the card by adding some Fashion Oyster pearls around the star. The pearls are also included in the stitch along kit, and I'm going to add a couple on the top left hand side, and then I add 3 on the bottom right. I do change my mind a little bit about where I want them to be, and thankfully, unless you press down too hard, you can pick those up and move them just so that you're happy with where they sit before you finally press them down. And that brings us to the end of my first card. It's a pretty clean and simple card, but I think as with any card that you have stitching on, it really helps to kick that card up a notch and is something pretty special for the recipient. So we're going to move on to our second card now, and I've gone ahead and done all of my die cutting. But this time I've die cut the star from the gold card in the stitch along kit. Just going to glue those 2 pieces together, and then I also go ahead and glue all of those 10 white pieces together as I did before. So just doubling those up for stability. For this card, I'm going to be doing the stitching with the red pink variegated thread, which is included in the kit, and I'm pulling out a really long strand of thread here. I want to make sure that I'm including that lightest pink in my stitching. So there's 6 strands in the DMC thread, and I've separated out 2 strands, and I'm just threading my needle up, and I'm going to bring that through my first die cut. And as I did before, I'm just securing the end of that thread at the back of the die cut with a couple of pieces of yellow tape. And now I can go ahead and stitch all of those 5 pieces, and I am going to show you all of the stitching, but I will speed it up a little bit. And I had intended to actually start off my stitching with the lightest pink, but I actually threaded it the wrong way round, and I started off by securing the darkest pink bit of that thread at the back. It didn't really matter, or it doesn't matter at all in fact, because I do use that whole piece of thread. I do end up with that lightest pink anyway, and I wanted to make sure that I could show a really clear transition of colour from the light pink through to the dark pink, and you definitely do get that at the end. And you can start to see here as I complete each piece and I lay them down onto my glass mat in front of me, you can definitely start seeing that transition appear. And I'm just coming to the end of the third die cut, and I'm still using that original piece of thread that I cut, and you can see here I'm now onto that lightest pink section of that thread. So it's actually on my third piece, not on my first, but I can adhere those onto the star in any way that I choose to get that transition going all the way around. I've finished my first piece of thread now, so I'm just threading my needle up with my second lot of thread. Again, I'm using 2 strands, and I make sure that the end that I secure at the back of my 4th die cut is a similar pink to the one that I finished on the previous die cut. So just securing that down, and I'm going to go ahead now and just stitch up those remaining 2 pieces. And wouldn't it be lovely if we could all stitch as quickly as I am currently on screen? I am actually quite slow at stitching, but I do really enjoy the process. This is very simple stitching as well. It's nothing fancy, and it's really therapeutic to do. Pop on some Christmas music and stitch away. The time just flies. And I'm moving on to that final piece now. You can already see the difference in colour on each of the individual die cuts. I think this is such a pretty thread. I've used it on several Christmas cards before, and I'm definitely going to be using it on some more. I'm just securing down that last piece of thread. And it's really satisfying when you see all those little pieces come together. And as I did before, I'm just going to glue those onto the star as evenly spaced as possible using some wet adhesive. And as you can see, I can move these around a little bit just to make sure the spacing is as accurate as possible. And don't forget that this is a star, so it can be used all year round. It's definitely not a die set that has to be used just for Christmas crafting. So I'm going to move on to the other parts of the card now. I've taken the Christmas bird Poinsettia etched dies, and I'm going to use those 4 foliage pieces and die cut them from 3 colours of cardstock. So I'm using white, teal topaz and waterfall cardstock, and I've gone ahead and die cut all of those pieces, which you can see in front of you. I've popped 2 layers of thin foam tape onto the back of my star, and I'm also adding some wet adhesive over those pieces just so that I can move that star around if I need to, and make sure I've got it positioned exactly where I want on my panel. So I'm going to go ahead and glue those pieces of foliage behind the star. So to get the right lengths, I do trim off the bottom of some of them, and I just stick those down with some glue. And I'm just aiming here to get a balance between the 3 different colours. I ended up die cutting more than I actually needed, but of course that doesn't matter. That just means I have some sitting there for a future card. And every so often I just take a breather and make sure that I'm happy with how the foliage is building up, that I'm happy with the spread of colours. Sometimes it means that I change things around a little bit. That's the advantage of using a glue, that you can often just pull them out without causing too much damage, to rearrange things as you see fit. So just finishing off here with adding those pieces on the bottom left hand side. And apologies here for flipping the panel around a lot as I add the die cuts. It's just much easier to move it around to make sure that I get them at the right angle. And I'm into the final 2 pieces now. I just add a darker piece of holly on the top left there, and then I finish by adding one more piece of holly using Waterfall cardstock, and I'm happy with how that looks. Okay, so moving on to our sentiment now, I'm going to foil some sentiments for this card. So I'm using a Merry Little Christmas sentiment set, and I'm going to foil with some champagne foil. So I've cut those pieces of foil to size. I've added the plates on top, and I'm just going to take those down with some little pieces of yellow tape. I find that really helpful. Not everyone foils the same, but this is the process that I follow. So just heating up my Glimmer machine, and when that's ready, I pop that panel down and then hit the button, and when that stops flashing, I can remove the platform from the base and run that through my die cutting machine. So I'm just going to remove the foil and plates, and now I'm going to go ahead and cut out the bottom sentiment with the coordinating die. The top one I just cut out using a paper trimmer. So I'm popping some foam tape onto the back of those, and I'm going to place those down into that top left hand corner of my panel. So I'm also just adding on a little bit of glue, which will enable me to move those around a little bit, just to make sure that they're straight and exactly in the place where I want them to be. So now I'm just going to take my Barely Art glue, add some adhesive onto the back of that panel, and place that down onto my card base. So just making sure that's fully adhered down onto the base. I'm now going to go ahead and finish the card off by adding some gold gems. So these are the Gold Mix Colour Essential Gems. There's two different colours of gold, and they come in different sizes as well. So just popping on those gold gems into the lower point of each of those 5 points on the star, and I'm also adding some amongst the foliage. And I'm just faffing around here trying to make sure that I've got the exact amount and where I want them to be. And that brings me to the end of both of my cards using day 5 of the Spellbinders 2024 12 Days of Stitchmas Advent Calendar and Stitch Along Kit. So I hope that you've enjoyed seeing them, and I thank you so much for being here with me today on my YouTube channel, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.